In my parents' generation, the Italian army were a complete punchline. There were many jokes like, did you hear about the new Italian tank? It has 2 gears forward and 3 backwards. Or did you see the new Italian fleet? It has glass bottoms to see the old Italian fleet. These were based around a ring of truth. The Italian army in World War II was frankly awful. They failed in conquering the much smaller nation of Greece, and lost many a battle with odds 4-1 in their favor against the British. When Italy itself was invaded, they immediately surrendered to the Allied powers. None of this could have been inferred from before the war. The entire ideology of fascism was based off militaristic strength and efficiency. Italy had spent years overhauling its army, making it on paper one of the best on earth. Italy had conquered Ethiopia, a nation which had previously defeated it twice. Mussolini's entire regime was based off reconquering the Roman Empire and making Italy the dominant military power. So one would expect a good military, right? So why was the Italian army terrible in World War II? It's hard to nail down a single definite reason. Their equipment wasn't perfect, but neither was Germany or practically anyone else's when the war started, and that didn't stop the war. The Italian troops were themselves often also quite individually brave. The reasons that come up the most are simply bad leadership and corruption. The Italian army was created by Mussolini's friends for their own personal wealth, and large amounts of money and time that should have been spent on the army instead line Mussolini's junta's pockets. The army was created for a World War I style war and never adapted when it became clear that that was not what was going to happen. There was also a lack of good leadership, with complete incompetency in the officery. Complete incompetency is a common trend in the Italian military in general in this time period. Everything that you would expect to work in a modern army, coordination, timescales, proper supply lines, etc., did not function. This was coupled with Italy's lack of industrial ability to support an enormous modern army, being half of Japan or Britain. I'm going to start this alternate history with an annoying at the same time profound point of departure. Mussolini puts the right guys in the right places when he recreates the Italian army. In this timeline, efficient people with good skills are placed in high places, and they in turn create a competent military with competent officers, etc., instead of Mussolini's thugs doing their own half-assed version. So in this timeline, the Italian army is at least mediocre, on the level of Britain, Japan, or France. This alternate history is actually the same until Mussolini declares war on the Allied powers. Mussolini is still in power and so makes the same decisions, it's just that he has a quality army to push up those decisions. The first change would be that the Italians conquer Greece in no time. The Italians outmatch the Greeks in number of men, quality of troops, and every token ever thought of. Thus, it's actually a shock that they failed so badly in our timeline. The Germans were able to conquer Greece in a matter of days, and the same thing happens in this timeline, with Italy conquering Greece quickly. The second theater the Italians were involved in was North Africa. Italians in Libya, their colony, outnumbered the British in Egypt by more than 3-1. This truly makes it embarrassing when they failed in their invasion of Egypt and were actually pushed back into Libya by the British, actually having 40,000 men being taken prisoner by 36,000 Britons. In this timeline, the Italians conquer Egypt easily, taking the Suez Canal. This would effectively split the British Empire in half, with British troops being forced to travel around the Cape of Good Hope to connect to the Empire, instead of using the shortcut through the Mediterranean. This would make British reinforcements to the Middle East impossible, and thus the Italians might as well conquer Mesopotamia and the Levant, thus driving the British out of the Middle East and giving the Axis lots of oil. If you think I'm OPing the Italians, just watch. The Italians had 90,000 white troops and 200,000 native troops in their colony of Ethiopia. Meanwhile, in neighboring British colonies of Sudan, there were only 9,000 troops, and in Kenya there were a similar number. What did the Italians do with their amazing advantage in number? Absolutely nothing. The Italians in Ethiopia just waited until the British built up enough force to crush them, even so being defeated against all odds. In this timeline, under at least moderately good leadership, the Italians would use their advantage in number to try to conquer the British colonies. Sudan would be an easy conquest, being unreinforceable with the loss of Egypt, and being only a small strip of fertile land around the River Nile, thus making it easy to split in half and subjugate. Kenya, meanwhile, would be much harder to conquer. The amount of actually livable land, unlike the Sudan, is enormous in Kenya, thus making it harder to conquer. The British could fight a guerrilla campaign in the region if the Italians conquered Nairobi, the capital, kind of like how the Germans kept fighting in Tanzania in World War I until the end of the war. Anyhow, the Italian advance would likely be blunted by the harsh terrain, lack of roads, and significant British reinforcements from South Africa and India. In our timeline, the Germans invaded the Balkans because Italy failed in Greece, and so they wouldn't have to worry about the Allies attacking up through the Balkans when they'd be bogged down in Russia. This in turn delayed their invasion of Russia by a few weeks. This never happens in this timeline. Instead, the Operation Barbarossa, or the invasion of Russia, goes ahead anyway earlier. However, the mud that spring was especially bad in Russia that year, and so the actual benefits of this gained time would be negligible because of this. The Germans would still fail in seizing Moscow and knocking out Russia. This is partially because of the previous reason, but also because of the Russian counterattack was so powerful that a difference of a few days would be unimportant. One of the basic facts of history was that Mussolini was a self-serving jerk. He did not honor treaties and acted only in his own interests. His goal was the conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean, the creation of a moderately sized empire. After achieving these goals, he would see no reason for the continuance of the war, which would basically just be the war in Russia at this point, which would only be in Germany's interests. Thus, he would have signed a side treaty with the Allies, giving them peace. Mussolini actually offered a side treaty to the Allies several times in our timeline, each of which were too greedy for them to accept, but he had no qualms about betraying Hitler. In this timeline, the Allies would be desperate enough for anything, and so would give Mussolini the lands he had already conquered in exchange for a peace deal. This would irk Hitler greatly, and he would probably make plans to destroy Mussolini after the end of the war, but he really didn't care about the Mediterranean, and his real goal was the conquest of Russia and Eastern Europe. With the war in Russia hanging in the balance, he would not have risked trying to destroy the Italian Empire, and so would instead have left it alone to try to defeat Russia first. The war in Europe would still end in a Nazi defeat. With the Russians still being able to turn the tide in the east, it would still destroy the Third Reich. Also, without the Mediterranean front, the Allies would be able to send their full entire force directly against Western Europe's Third Reich. I'm not exactly sure how the war would play out, but the Nazis would lose. Meanwhile, the Japanese would still be defeated in the end in the east for the same reasons they were in our timeline. This would put the Italian Empire in a tough place. They'd be stuck in the Cold War world of the Russians versus the Americans. They would be a Cold War empire in a world in which all the others were in decline. They would be enormous physically, but in actual industrial and economic ability would be quite weak. In this state, they'd become a buffer state between the Russians and the Americans, getting subsidies from whichever side it was advantageous for at the time. The British and French would wish to reconquer the Italian Empire, but both would be so exhausted that they would be unable to do so, and the Americans, not believing in an overt imperialism, would not support any such operation. The Italians planned on populating Libya, making it majority Italian. This would actually be surprisingly easy, with Italy's population being 45 million at the time, while Libya's being a mere 1 million. This would mean that Libya would likely become majority Italian in this timeline, being dragged into part of the Italian homeland. A similar process would also likely happen in Eritrea, which had a large Italian population before World War II, with its capital Asmara actually being majority Italian. The more heavily populated regions like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Ethiopia would however remain staunchly native, despising their Italian overlords. It's hard to imagine how an Italian empire would end, or if it would. It seems hard to imagine that they could maintain being in power in an age of rising populations in the Third World, but given that a fair part of the empire would be majority Italian, it means they would be forced to maintain part of their empire simply to keep their citizens safe. Likely the more staunchly native parts of the empire would leave as their populations would rise. Regions like Iraq, Yemen, or Syria would likely leave the empire this way. The big issue would be Egypt. This is because it would connect the ethnic Italian regions like Libya and Eritrea, and likely parts of Sudan with each other, but would itself be heavily populated with natives. Expect enormous tensions as Egyptians would fight bloody wars of independence while being supported by the communists, British, or Americans, depending on the timing. It's impossible to know, but if I had to guess what the Italian state would be like today, I would bet that it would be some sort of union of Italic-speaking states, withholding the Sinai and the Suez to maintain connection between them, but with the non-Italian-speaking parts of the empire splitting off. What if Altist? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next one. Thank you.